Find that the British Empire, after the French and Indian War, having won that war, was considered the freest empire of the world at the time. It offered free trade, it offered freedom of commerce across the seas. People were actually getting quite wealthy in certain colonies, like in New York and North Carolina. The lumber industry, for example, in Boston and places like New York, was thriving because of their trade with England. And of course, in England, they manufactured goods and would sell it back to the colonies, as well as colonies throughout not just what would be called the United States, but also throughout the world, including the West Indies. And so the question was, what do we do with England? Do we continue on the path of remaining very loyal and very connected to England for all the benefits we are getting? And you also had Anglican ministers and clerics who were tied to England because the Anglican Church was the Church of England. And so they felt a very strong loyalty to that church and to the king and the authority that that church, you know, presided over them. And so they felt the need to really honor that authority. And so, you had a good contingent of continentals who really wanted to stay loyal to England. And you had many who wanted to break away entirely. And you also had those who were kind of in the middle. They weren't in love with England, so to speak, but they weren't fully sold on breaking away entirely. In fact, they believed that reconciliation with England and working with England, doing things through the proper channels, through petitions and reaching out to Parliament and the parliamentary representatives, they would be able to get their needs met. I think, for example, of one particular gentleman by the name of John Dickinson, who wrote in 1768, and he basically comes out and says, the Stamp Act was wrong, the stamp tax that was placed on us, and all these other acts that are being placed on us are wrong. But we believe in staying loyal to England. We don't want to, you know, become a mob of angry, disaffected colonists who will rise up against our Mother England. We want to work with Mother England, but we would like Mother England to work with us. And so we are really wanting there to be reconciliation and working together in order for there to be, less problems. So it really was a very divided continent. The colonies were not altogether full-fledged on board with independence. That's really important to keep in mind. In fact, the first and second Continental Congresses were not fully on board with full-on independence just yet. Um, Many of them were trying to work out differences with England, make their grievances known, and if those grievances would not be acknowledged, then they may have to try different avenues. So, what led to this moment of the debate, right? What led to all of this? Well, a lot of it had to do with the taxation, as I mentioned. A lot of it had to do with uh, the growing the growing fear that England was not going to adhere to the grievances that the colonists had, that they would continue to tax the colonists. And so you had groups like the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty that would, for example, tar and feather and intimidate tax collectors. And you had, a lot of pushes to really set the record straight. For example, the non-importation agreements that the colonists placed on England in order to punish England for basically taxing them on tea, paper, white lead, glass, paint, you name it. By the way, these taxes were quite small. Okay, these taxes were not big taxes like the taxes we pay today. These were like minimal taxes. They're called consumption taxes, taxes on things that people consumed, such as taxes on stamps, or taxes on tea, or taxes on glass, or taxes on paper. And so, in the big scheme of things, really, these were just not a big deal. But to many people who relied on these products, for example, printers and writers and people who worked with glass and people who worked with tea or paint, this was a big deal because they relied on those things. And once you tax things that people rely on, they are now paying extra, and that money is going to support the mother country of England. Another thing to keep in mind is the population change around this time, the 1770s. The continental United States, the makeup and the demography of of what will be called the United States was changing quite rapidly. Okay, the population was growing. You had now third generation, fourth generation Americans living on this continent, and they were not feeling tied to England at all. Many of them were not English. Many of them were came from other parts of Europe, or they had ancestry outside of England, and they really did not see England as their mother country. And I think this is where Thomas Paine's work comes in. Thomas Paine does go into discussing the government. He talks a lot about the purpose of government. And he comes to the conclusion very early on in his tract, Common Sense, that the best form of government is really a republic. It is a government that is run and ruled by the people. To Thomas Paine, the worst form of government and the most tyrannical form of government was a monarchy. He believed that even though the English Constitution had a king and a House of Commons, he believed that no matter whether the commoners checked the king, the bottom line was that the king had the final say. And so, really, there was no freedom in a monarchy to Thomas Paine. And this sort of threw off a lot of people reading his work. They found it to be very radical because to many people, the English Constitution and the English form of government was one of the best forms of government, most freest forms of government. And the idea of people ruling over themselves or ruling over government was very dangerous to them. You know, the word democracy, for example, was not a good word for many people. It was actually a very bad word. And this goes as far back as the Greeks. If we go back to ancient Athens, we learn that the Athenians experimented with democracy, but it was not a popular form of government. In fact, most of Greece at that time had dabbled into oligarchy or monarchy, but never full on democracy. So Athens was sort of the first example of democracy. But after that, it was very hard for countries or even small city states to develop democracies. You always had to have an aristocracy of talent or a hereditary talent that would rule over the people, because the idea was you want the best and the brightest in government to rule over the people. And so it really was, to many, a radical tract. To John Adams, particularly, although he believed in a idea of a republic, he really thought that Thomas Paine was taking it a step way too far by saying that the people themselves should just rule the government and, have access to government. John Adams and many like him, many founding fathers like him, believed that that it was important to have some level of an articulated sort of hereditary class that would rule over the people, because they would be considered most prepared and most trained for government. Not to Thomas Paine, though, right? So he really does talk a lot about the importance of a republic, and he spends a lot of time in the tract on the part 3 portion, Thoughts on the Present State of American Affairs. He starts off by saying this. I think it's very important. He says, "In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense, and have no other preliminaries to settle with the reader than that he will divest himself of prejudice and prepossession, and suffer his reason and his feelings to determine for themselves. that he will put on, or rather that he will not put off, the true character of a man, and generously enlarge his views beyond the present day. In other words, Thomas Paine is starting off this portion of the tract saying, it's time to talk about common sense. It's time to talk about the true nature of a man, the true character of a man. What is that true character? Well, to him, it's freedom. Freedom is the true character of a man. And so it is important now to look beyond just the present day, that which makes us comfortable, that which we are afraid to challenge. We may need to look into the future and see where exactly is our relationship with England going. And so he goes on to blame the king for a lot of the problems, but he also begins the process of trying to help the Continentals in America see the value of breaking away from England. This is what he says. He says, I have heard it asserted by some that as America hath flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, that the same connection is necessary towards her future happiness and will always have the same effect. Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. But even this is admitting more than is true. For I answer roundly that America would have flourished as much and probably much more had no European power had anything to do with her. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, and will always have a market, while eating is the custom of Europe. What is he saying here? What Paine is saying ultimately is, yes, America has thrived from being connected to England, just as a child thrives upon his mother's milk. But does a child, as he grows up, rely on his mother's milk? No. Eventually, that child has to grow up and assert his own manliness and his own ability to take care of himself and reason for himself. And so he says, it's very important that we say, just because things are working out now with England, that to assume they would work out the same way in the next 20 years is really not very wise. He then goes on to talk about how, is England the parent country? Is it really the mother country of the continental, the continent of the New World? And here he says no. He says no. This country was founded upon so many different immigrants all over Europe. And so because of that, because it's made up of so many different Europeans, we can't claim that everyone is English or has English roots. He says there were Swedes in this country, Germans, Dutch. Uh, how would they think England to be their mother country? So in that sense, he says, once you develop your mindset as a continental on this North American continent, you now are seeing yourself as something very distinct from the old world. You are now something new. Your identity is new. And so it is time to break free and exert our independence and really see how important that is and how commonsensical that is. Well, is this common sense? Is this common sense? James Chalmers, who wrote the tract Plain Truth, will challenge Thomas Paine's views. Okay, now his tract is just as long as Thomas Paine's, and so I'm just going to read a little bit from his tract. He really goes after Thomas Paine's argument that the English Constitution and the English government is really very oppressive as a monarchy. And this is what he says. He says, after his terrible anathema against our venerable Constitution, he's referring to Thomas Paine going after the English Constitution, and monarchy, let us briefly examine a democratical state and see whether or not it is a government less sanguinary. This government is extremely plausible and indeed flattering to the pride of mankind. The demagogues, therefore, to seduce the people into their criminal designs, ever hold up democracy to them. Although conscious it never did, nor ever will answer in practice. If we believe a great author, there never existed nor ever will exist a real democracy in the world. If we examine the republics of Greece and Rome, we ever find them in a state of war, domestic or foreign. Our author therefore makes no mention of these ancient states. He goes on to say that really democracy is a dangerous form of government, that ultimately, he says, that to rely on the people, to take care of matters, to rely on the people to know how to handle government, how to assert government, is to him preposterous. And I would say most nations at this time believed James Chalmers. They would have agreed that to even consider a democracy or a republic would have been dangerous, because who really will take over government? In the very end, though, I just wanted to read the very last part of James Chalmers' tract. He says, "Volumes were sufficient to describe the horror, misery, and desolation awaiting the people at large in the siren form of American independence. In short, I affirm that it would be most excellent policy, and those who wish for true liberty, to submit by an advantageous reconciliation to the great authority of Great Britain, to accomplish in the long run what they cannot do by hypocrisy, fraud, and force in the short one. Independence and slavery are synonymous terms." Well, that's interesting. Freedom and slavery are synonymous terms. Ultimately, what James Chalmers is saying is that when people have too much freedom, when people are given the reins to take over government, the possibility of tyranny and the possibility of enslavement to a mob is very possible. And so, to men like James Chalmers, he believed that to break away from England would only create an enslaved colonist population among colonists who would abuse their power, if not worse than a king, and declare themselves the sole authority. And in that sense, tyranny cannot be avoided. So, whose side do you think you would be on in this case? Would you have sided with James Chalmers, saying that democracy was dangerous, that it's important to maintain authority, that a monarchy is not a bad form of government, but rather an important, sustainable one that will protect the people? And as long as it's a free trade system and people are thriving under this system, there should be no problems? Or do you side with Thomas Paine, someone who fervently believed that when you are under the authority of one man who has absolute power, you are in essence enslaved under that one man, and he will always have the ultimate power and final check on your authority? This is the debate of the revolution. And of course, as we learn, our founding fathers did choose the route of Thomas Paine, but they did still believe very strongly in maintaining a level of government and a form of government that would suppress tyranny, that would have a series of checks and balances so as no one group would usurp or abuse power over another, and really ultimately that freedom cannot exist without some level of self restraint. And so, as we navigate this course and further go into American history, we learn that the Revolution was not just a war to win independence, but also a movement to declare freedom: freedom from tyranny, freedom from an abusive government, and freedom to put the public interest ahead of one's own private interest.